Imagine a map of the Atlantic Ocean, stretched wide from the harbors of Bristol and London all the way across to the jagged coastline of Newfoundland and down through the Caribbean. Now trace a line. Start at the English Channel. Pull it southwest past the coast of Portugal, down to the Canary Islands, where the trade winds catch your sails and push you west across 3,000 miles of open water. Weeks of nothing but horizon. That line ends somewhere in the warm turquoise shallows of Nassau or Tortuga or Port Royal. That is the route everyone pictures when they think of pirates. Sun-drenched decks, rum in the afternoon, a hammock swaying gently under a tropical sky. Now trace another line. Start at the same English Channel, but this time pull it northwest, past Ireland, past the edge of the known world, as far as many 17th century sailors were concerned, out into the brutal gray churn of the North Atlantic, where the Labrador Current drags freezing Arctic water south and collides with the Gulf Stream in a violent mess of fog, ice, and unpredictable storms. That line ends at the Grand Banks off Newfoundland, where by the early 1700s, over 300 English ships were making the annual crossing to fish for cod. And where pirates like Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, would show up with a fleet of armed vessels to recruit fishermen, steal supplies, and terrorize entire harbors, before sailing back south toward warmer water. Both of those lines are real pirate routes, and the second one, the cold one, the miserable one, is the one nobody talks about. Because here is what the movies never show you. Pirates did not live exclusively in the Caribbean. They followed trade routes, and trade routes went everywhere. They went up the coast of North America from Florida to Nova Scotia. They crossed the North Atlantic to raid fishing fleets. They sailed around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean, a journey that could take months through some of the most violent seas on Earth. And during all of those voyages, during all of those freezing, rain-soaked, wind-battered weeks at sea, they had to sleep somewhere. So how did they do it? How did 150 men cram themselves into a rotting wooden ship with no heating, no insulation, and no privacy in the middle of an ocean where the water temperature alone could kill you in minutes? How did they actually survive the night? That is what this video is about. And by the end, you will never look at a pirate ship the same way again. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Let us start with the ship itself, because understanding where pirates slept means understanding what a pirate ship actually was. And it was not what you think. The typical pirate vessel during the Golden Age, roughly 1650 to 1730, was not some grand galleon with 100 cannons. Most pirate ships were captured merchant vessels, sloops, brigantines, sometimes a frigate if they got lucky. These were working ships designed to move cargo, not to house large crews in comfort. A merchant vessel might carry a crew of 15 to 20 men. When pirates captured that same ship, they would pack it with 150, sometimes 200 men. The math alone tells you what sleeping conditions were like. You are taking a vessel built for 20 people and multiplying the population by 10. There were no extra rooms, no extra beds, no extra anything. The primary living space for the crew was the forecastle, the raised section at the front of the ship. On a merchant vessel, this was where the regular sailors lived, cooked, stored their weapons and clothing, and slept. One historical description of a forecastle reads, and I am quoting from memory here, "A small dark cave, without light or warmth, sometimes 6 or 7 foot square, for 6 or 7 men, stowed half full of rope and sails, damp and wet." That was for 6 or 7 men on a merchant ship. Now imagine that same space with 40 men jammed inside. The forecastle was cramped, filthy, and the air inside was nearly unbreathable. The only light came from tallow candles, which produced a greasy, flickering glow and added their own smell to the already overwhelming stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, tar, and rotting food. In warm weather, the forecastle was sweltering. In cold weather, it was freezing. There was no in-between. Below the main deck, the situation was somehow worse. The lower decks of a sailing ship were perpetually damp. Water seeped through the planking above during storms, pooled in the bilge at the bottom, and never fully dried. The wood itself absorbed moisture like a sponge. Everything down there was wet. Your clothes were wet. Your bedding, if you had any, was wet. The ropes you might curl up next to were wet. And in cold climates, wet plus cold equals a very specific kind of misery that is hard to describe unless you have experienced it. It seeps into your bones. Your muscles never fully relax because your body is constantly trying to generate heat. You shiver in your sleep, if you sleep at all. And this is the critical thing to understand. There was no heating on a pirate ship. None. The only fire on board was in the galley, a small brick or iron cooking area usually located on the main deck. And the galley fire was strictly controlled because an open flame on a wooden ship loaded with gunpowder is about as dangerous as it sounds. You could not gather around it for warmth. You could not bring a candle to your sleeping spot without risking the entire vessel. The ship was your shelter, but it offered almost no protection from the cold beyond keeping the wind and rain off you. And sometimes it could not even manage that. So what did pirates actually sleep on? The answer is complicated, because it depended on the ship, the era, and frankly, how lucky you were. The hammock is the first thing anyone pictures, and they are not wrong, but the history is more interesting than you might expect. Hammocks were not originally a European invention. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Bahamas in 1492, he observed the Taino people sleeping in woven cotton nets suspended between trees. The Spanish word hamaca comes directly from Taino. European sailors adopted the concept almost immediately because it solved a very real problem. Before hammocks, sailors slept on bare wooden boards. Sometimes they had straw mats or bags stuffed with leaves, or in rare cases, mattresses filled with horsehair. All of these options shared the same problems. They sat on the deck, which meant they absorbed every drop of water that leaked through from above. They rotted, they attracted vermin, and worst of all, they did not protect you from the motion of the ship. Before hammocks became standard, sailors were routinely injured and sometimes killed when they rolled off their sleeping surfaces during storms. Imagine being asleep on a wooden plank when the ship lurches sideways. You slide across the deck in the dark, along with loose cannonballs, barrels, coils of rope, and whatever else is not lashed down. Broken bones, cracked skulls, crushed fingers. It happened constantly. The hammock changed all of that. A canvas hammock, slung from hooks in the overhead beams, swayed with the ship instead of fighting against it. It wrapped around the sleeper like a cocoon, making an accidental fall nearly impossible. It kept you off the wet deck. It could be taken down during the day and stowed, freeing up space. And when a sailor died, his hammock became his burial shroud, sewn closed with a cannonball at his feet and slid overboard. The hammock was brilliant, and by the mid-1600s, it was standard equipment on most European naval and merchant vessels. But here is the thing about pirate ships. They were not most vessels. Pirates operated outside the system. They did not receive standardized equipment from a naval supply chain. They used whatever they could steal, scavenge, or improvise. Some pirate ships had hammocks for the crew. Many did not, especially when the crew was 3 or 4 times larger than the ship was designed for. Even on ships that had hammocks, there were rarely enough for everyone, and the hammocks they did have were often in terrible condition, frayed, moldy, stiff with salt. Captain William Snellgrave, a merchant captain who was captured by pirates and held aboard their vessel, wrote about the sleeping conditions he observed. He noted that, quote, "Everyone lay rough," as they called it, that is, on the deck. The captain himself was not even allowed a bed. This phrase, laying rough, was common among pirates and meant exactly what it sounds like. You slept on the open deck, or wherever you could find space, with no bedding and no comfort. A mat on the planking, if you were fortunate, your own coat bundled under your head as a pillow. Nothing between you and the cold, hard wood except whatever you were wearing. The buccaneer William Dampier, who sailed in the late 1600s, described a slightly better version of this. He wrote that when the ship was at anchor, the deck was spread with mats for the men to lie on. Every man had one mat, some had two, and with a pillow for the head and a rug for covering, that was all the bedding that was necessary. Notice what is missing from that description. Walls, privacy, warmth. You are sleeping on a mat on the deck of a ship, under a rug, in the open air. In the Caribbean, that might actually be pleasant on a calm night. Off the coast of Newfoundland in October, it would be a nightmare. And pirates absolutely did sail to Newfoundland. The Grand Banks fishery was one of the most important economic resources in the North Atlantic during the 17th and 18th centuries. By 1615, around 250 English ships were making the annual spring voyage to Newfoundland, bringing home over 250,000 hundredweight of preserved cod by autumn. By 1620, that number had risen to 300 vessels, employing more than 6,000 sailors. For pirates, this was an irresistible target, not primarily for the fish, although they would take that too, but for the manpower. Newfoundland was a recruiting ground. Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart, arguably the most successful pirate in history, with nearly 500 ships captured during his career, raided the Newfoundland coast in 1720. When he arrived at Trepassey Harbor, every one of the more than 100 ships anchored there had been abandoned by their terrified crews. Robert spent 2 weeks terrorizing the area, and when he left, numerous fishermen had joined his crew. They did not join because they wanted to be pirates, necessarily. They joined because their lives as fishermen were already so brutal that piracy seemed like an improvement. And keep in mind, these fishermen were accustomed to the cold. They worked in it every day. The fact that they chose to sail with Roberts tells you something about how desperate their situation already was. But sailing south with Roberts did not mean the cold was behind them. The journey from Newfoundland back to warmer waters could take weeks, even months, depending on wind conditions. The North Atlantic in autumn is one of the most hostile environments on Earth for a wooden sailing vessel. The temperature drops into the low 30s Fahrenheit, sometimes into the 22nd. The wind drives rain horizontally across the deck. Waves crash over the bow and soak everything and everyone below. And through all of it, you still have to sleep. So how did they manage? The first and most important survival mechanism was body heat. When 150 men are packed into the lower decks of a ship, they generate a significant amount of warmth simply by being alive. The human body at rest produces roughly the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Multiply that by 150, and you have the thermal output of a decent space heater. In the enclosed spaces below deck, where ventilation was poor and the ceilings were low, all those bodies raised the ambient temperature noticeably. This was not comfortable by any modern standard. The air was thick, humid, and reeked of sweat, mildew, and the contents of the bilge below, but it was warmer than the open deck, and in freezing conditions, that was enough to matter. Men slept pressed together, not out of affection, but out of necessity. You shared your body heat, or you froze. The second mechanism was clothing. Sailors in this era wore wool almost exclusively when they could get it. Wool has a remarkable property that cotton does not. It retains a significant amount of its insulating ability even when wet. A soaked cotton shirt will suck the heat from your body. A soaked wool shirt will still keep you somewhat warm. Experienced sailors knew this, and they layered wool garments as heavily as they could afford. A typical cold weather outfit for a sailor might include a wool shirt, a heavy waistcoat, a thick wool jacket or farnot jacket, wool stockings, and canvas or leather trousers treated with tar to to make them somewhat water-resistant. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Some sailors wore knitted wool caps called Monmouth caps, which covered the ears and provided critical insulation for the head, where a huge proportion of body heat is lost. But pirates, again, were not regular sailors. They wore whatever they had stolen from, captured ships, or stripped from their enemies. Some pirates were extravagantly dressed in stolen finery. Others wore rags. The distribution of warm clothing on a pirate ship was wildly uneven, and if you were a new recruit who came aboard with nothing but the shirt on your back, you might spend weeks shivering violently every night until you could scavenge something warmer. The third mechanism was alcohol. Rum, brandy, whatever was available. The ration of alcohol aboard ship was not just a luxury or a morale booster. It was, in the minds of sailors at the time, a genuine medicine against the cold. Modern science tells us they were wrong about this. Alcohol actually lowers your core body temperature by dilating blood vessels near the skin, which creates a sensation of warmth while actually accelerating heat loss. But the sensation of warmth was convincing enough to fool your brain, and the sedative effect of alcohol made it easier to fall asleep despite the discomfort. A man who has had enough rum can sleep through things that would keep a sober man awake all night. And on a pirate ship, sleeping through the misery was sometimes the best strategy available. One of the most overlooked aspects of sleeping on a pirate ship was the watch system. Ships did not simply stop at night. Someone always had to be on deck, steering, watching for other vessels, monitoring the weather, adjusting the sails. On most ships, the crew was divided into 2 watches that alternated in 4-hour shifts. This meant you were never sleeping for more than 4 hours at a time. Often less, because the transition between watches was noisy. The man replacing you might wake you early. And if there was any kind of emergency, a storm, a sighting, a torn sail, everyone was called on deck regardless of whose watch it was. This chronic sleep deprivation was one of the defining features of life at sea. You were always tired, always running on fragments of rest stolen between duties. And the quality of that sleep was appalling even when you could get it. The noise alone would keep most modern people awake indefinitely. A wooden sailing ship is never quiet. The timbers creak and groan constantly as the hull flexes with the waves. The rigging hums and whistles in the wind. The sails snap and flap. Water slaps against the hull. The bilge pumps thud rhythmically. And layered underneath all of that, the sounds of 150 men breathing, coughing, snoring, scratching, shifting, arguing, and occasionally fighting in the darkness. Then there were the rats. Rats were as much a part of a ship's crew as the sailors themselves. They lived in the hold, in the bilge, in the walls, in the sleeping quarters. They chewed through food stores, through clothing, through ropes. They ran across sleeping men in the dark. They bit, and they carried disease. The fleas on the rats carried plague. The rats themselves spread leptospirosis through their urine, which contaminated the bilge water that seeped into everything below deck. Sailors sleeping in the lower holds were essentially lying in a disease vector. The combination of rat urine, fecal matter, seawater, and rotting food created an environment that modern epidemiologists would consider a biohazard. Lice were another constant companion. Body lice lived in the seams of clothing and fed on human blood, causing relentless itching that made sleep nearly impossible. Both body lice and head lice spread typhus, a disease that killed sailors in enormous numbers throughout the age of sail. You could not escape them. You could not wash your clothes in hot water because there was no hot water. You could not bathe because fresh water was too precious. You lived with the lice, scratched constantly, and hoped you did not get sick. Now here is something that actually separated pirate ships from naval or merchant vessels, and it is one of the most interesting aspects of this entire story. Pirates were more democratic about sleeping arrangements than any other sailors of their era. On a Royal Navy ship, the hierarchy of sleeping was absolute. The captain had his own cabin at the stern with real furniture and a real bed. Officers had smaller, individual cabins, and the common sailors were crammed into the forecastle or the gun deck, where they slung their hammocks in rows so tight that when one man turned over, his hammock bumped the man next to him on both sides. Pirates rejected this entirely. One of the foundational principles of pirate governance was a radical form of equality. The pirate articles, the written agreements that crews voted on before every voyage, typically specified that no man, including the captain, was entitled to private quarters. Captain Snellgrave, the merchant captain who was captured by pirates, was genuinely offended by the fact that the pirate captain did not even have his own bed. The pirates saw this differently. They saw private cabins as a symbol of the oppressive class system they had escaped by becoming pirates. Many of these men had served in the Royal Navy or on merchant ships, where captains lived in relative luxury while the crew suffered. On a pirate ship, everyone suffered equally. This egalitarian approach had practical implications for sleeping. On a pirate ship, laying rough was not just what the poor sailors did while the captain slept in a real bed. Laying rough was what everyone did. The captain slept on the deck next to the newest recruit. The quartermaster slept on the same planking as the cook. This was unusual, even radical, for the era. And while it did not make sleeping on a freezing ship any more comfortable, it created a sense of shared experience that bonded pirate crews together in ways that naval crews rarely experienced. There is one more element of cold weather sleeping that deserves attention, and it is something that most historical accounts barely mention: the psychological dimension. Sleep deprivation in cold, wet, miserable conditions does things to your mind. Modern research on the effects of chronic sleep loss combined with cold stress shows that cognitive function degrades rapidly. Decision-making becomes impaired. Emotional regulation breaks down. Paranoia and irritability increase dramatically. Men who are cold, tired, hungry, and crammed together in a dark, stinking hold are men who are on the edge of violence at all times. This explains a lot about pirate behavior that is often attributed to simple cruelty or lawlessness. When you have not slept properly in weeks, when your clothes have been wet for so long that the skin on your feet is peeling off, when rats have been running across your face in the dark, your threshold for violence drops to almost zero. The legendary brutality of some pirate crews was not just a product of criminal personalities. It was a product of conditions that would break anyone, and the cold itself was a killer, even when it did not freeze you outright. Hypothermia does not always announce itself dramatically. Mild hypothermia creeps in slowly. Your body temperature drops a degree or two below normal. You start shivering. Your fingers go numb. Your thinking gets cloudy. You curl up tighter. You pull your coat over your head. And if you are already exhausted and malnourished, which most sailors were, your body does not have the caloric reserves to fight the cold effectively. Men died in their sleep on ships. They simply got too cold, too tired, too depleted, and their hearts stopped. In the morning, the man next to you would not wake up, and the crew would sew him into his hammock or wrap him in canvas and slide him over the side. Business as usual. The diseases that thrived in these conditions were staggering. Scurvy from vitamin C deficiency was the most famous killer, but tuberculosis spread easily in cramped sleeping quarters. Dysentery ravaged crews who drank contaminated water. Typhus, carried by lice, could sweep through a ship and kill a quarter of the crew in weeks. Pneumonia thrived in cold, wet conditions. The sleeping quarters were the breeding ground for all of it. Sailors had their own folk remedies and rituals for surviving cold nights at sea. Some believed that sleeping with your head toward the bow of the ship brought bad luck, so they slept with their heads toward the stern. Some hung their hammocks near the galley chimney, hoping to catch residual warmth from the cooking fire. Some slept in shifts with their closest companions, alternating who slept on the outside of the group, where the cold was worst, and who slept in the protected center. These were not formal arrangements. They were survival strategies, passed down from experienced sailors to new recruits, developed through generations of trial and error. Some crews rigged canvas screens below deck to create wind barriers and trap body heat in smaller compartments. Others stuffed oakum, the loose hemp fiber used for caulking seams, into the gaps between planks to reduce drafts. On ships that had been captured from navies or wealthy merchants, pirates sometimes found actual blankets, pillows, or mattresses among the cargo. These were prized possessions, fought over, stolen, and jealously guarded. A good wool blanket on a freezing ship was worth more than gold coins, because gold could not keep you alive through a North Atlantic night, but wool could. The diet of pirates also played a role in their ability to survive the cold, though mostly in a negative way. The standard diet aboard ship was salt beef or salt pork, ship's biscuit riddled with weevils, and whatever fresh food had not yet spoiled. Fresh vegetables and fruit were non-existent after the first week at sea. This meant pirates were chronically malnourished, lacking the vitamins and minerals the body needs to regulate temperature and fight infection. A well-fed person can tolerate cold far better than a malnourished one. Pirates were almost never well-fed after the first few days of a voyage. There were some exceptions to this general picture of misery. When pirates were operating in the Caribbean or along the African coast, sleeping conditions improved dramatically. In warm weather, sleeping on the open deck under the stars was genuinely pleasant. The buccaneer tradition of sleeping on deck mats was born in the tropics and worked well there. A warm breeze, a clear sky, the gentle rocking of the ship at anchor. This is the pirate sleeping experience that Hollywood has romanticized, and it was real, but it was only one version of the reality. The other version, the cold version, the North Atlantic version, was so horrible that experienced sailors dreaded it for weeks before it arrived. When a ship left the Caribbean and began heading north or east across the Atlantic, the crew knew what was coming. The temperature would drop day by day. The rain would shift from warm tropical downpours to cold, slashing, wind-driven sheets that soaked everything and never stopped. And the nights would get longer, darker, and colder, until every sleeping hour became an exercise in pure endurance. Some pirates tried to avoid cold weather sailing entirely. The seasonal pattern of piracy in the North Atlantic reflects this. Pirates would arrive at Newfoundland during the summer months, recruit crew, stock up on supplies, and leave before the cold set in. They migrated south with the seasons, following the warmth like birds. Those who miscalculated and stayed too long in northern waters paid a terrible price. There is a broader point here about what piracy actually was, beyond the adventure and romance. At its core, piracy was labor. Hard, brutal, physical labor performed under conditions that would be considered a human rights violation by modern standards. The sleeping conditions were just one part of a larger picture of suffering that included malnutrition, disease, violence, and the constant threat of capture and execution. This was the context in which men chose to become pirates. The alternative, life as a merchant sailor or oppressed man in the Royal Navy, was often just as miserable, but without the possibility of a big score that might let you retire. The pirate ship was a floating contradiction, a place of radical democracy and of brutal violence, of shared suffering and individual cruelty. And every night, when the sun went down and the temperature dropped and the wind picked up, that contradiction resolved itself into one simple reality. You were cold. You were tired. You were surrounded by men who were cold and tired. And you had to find a way to close your eyes and rest, because tomorrow you would need the strength to do it all over again. The ships themselves eventually disappeared. The last great age of piracy ended around 1000 730, when navies became too well-armed and organized for pirates to operate effectively. The Golden Age closed, and the ships rotted, sank, or were broken apart for timber. But the experience of sleeping on those ships, the cold, the dark, the noise, the rats, the press of human bodies seeking warmth, that experience echoed forward through centuries of maritime history. Every sailor who ever served on a wooden ship knew some version of it. We have climate-controlled staterooms now, heated bunks, electric blankets, memory foam mattresses. We have conquered the problem so completely that nobody even considers it anymore. But for 3 centuries, the question of how to sleep on a freezing ship with no heating was not theoretical. It was the most immediate, most personal, most inescapable challenge of life at sea. And the answer, for pirates and sailors alike, was almost always the same. You did not sleep well. You just survived the night.